Twain writes, on the final leg of his journey to Carson, on the 19th day we crossed the great American desert, 40 memorable miles of bottomless sand, into which the coach wheels sunk from 6 inches to a foot. We worked our passage most of the way across, that is to say, we got out and walked. It was a dreary pull, and a long and thirsty one, for we had no water. From one extremity of this desert to the other, the road was white with the bones of oxen and horses. It would hardly be an exaggeration to say that we could have walked 40 miles and set our feet on a bone at every step. The desert was one prodigious graveyard, and the log chains, wagon tires, and rotting wrecks of vehicles were almost as thick as the bones. I think we saw log chains enough rusting there in the desert to reach across any state in the Union. Did not these relics suggest something of an idea of the fearful suffering and privation the early immigrants to California endured? At the border of the desert lies Carson Lake, or the sink of the Carson, a shallow, melancholy sheet of water some 80 or 100 miles in circumference. Carson River empties into it and is lost, sinks mysteriously into the earth, and never appears in the light of the sun again, for the lake has no outlet whatever. There are several rivers in Nevada, and they all have this mysterious fate. They end in various lakes or sinks, and that is the last of them. Carson Lake, Humboldt Lake, Walker Lake, Mono Lake are all great sheets of water without any visible outlet. Water is always flowing into them, and none is ever seen to flow out of them, and yet they remain always level full, neither receding nor overflowing. What they do with the surplus is only known to the Creator. On the western verge of the desert we halted a moment at Ragtown. It consisted of one log house and is not set down on the map. We were approaching the end of our long journey. It was the morning of the 20th day. At noon we would reach Carson City, capital of Nevada Territory. We were not glad but sorry. It had been a fine pleasure trip, and we had fed fat on wonders every day. We were now well accustomed to stage life and very fond of it, so the idea of coming to a standstill and settling down to a humdrum existence in a village was not agreeable, but on the contrary depressing. Visibly our new home was a desert, walled in by barren, snow-clad mountains. There was not a tree in sight. There was no vegetation but the endless sagebrush and greasewood. All nature was gray with it. We were plowing through great deeps of powdery alkali dust that rose in thick clouds and floated across the plain like smoke from a burning house. We were coated with it like millers. So were the coach, the mules, the mailbags, the driver. We and the sagebrush and the other scenery were all one monotonous color. Long trains of freight wagons in the distance, enveloped in ascending masses of dust, suggested pictures of prairies on fire. These teams and their masters were the only life we saw. Otherwise, we moved in the midst of solitude, silence, and desolation. Every 20 steps we passed the skeleton of some dead beast of burden, with its dust-coated skin stretched tightly over its empty ribs. Frequently a solemn raven sat upon the skull or the hips and contemplated the passing coach with meditative serenity. By and by, Carson City was pointed out to us. It nestled in the edge of a great plain. and was a sufficient number of miles away to look like an assemblage of mere white spots in the shadow of a grim range of mountains overlooking it, whose summits seemed lifted clear out of companionship and consciousness of earthly things. We arrived, disembarked, and the stage went on. It was a wooden town, its population 2,000 souls. The main street consisted of 4 or 5 blocks of little white-frame stores, which were too high to sit down on, but not too high for various other purposes. In fact, hardly high enough. They were packed close together, side by side, as if room were scarce in that mighty plain. The sidewalk was of boards that were more or less loose and inclined to rattle when walked upon. In the middle of the town, opposite the stores, was the plaza, which is native to all towns beyond the Rocky Mountains, a large, unfenced, level vacancy with a liberty pole in it, and very useful as a place for public auctions, horse trades, and mass meetings, and likewise for teamsters to camp in. 2 other sides of the plaza were faced by stores, offices, and stables. The rest of Carson City was pretty scattering. This from Burton, from Sand Springs Station. About 11 a.m., we set off across 10 miles of valley that stretched between us and the summit of the western divide, still separating us from Carson Lake. The land was a smooth, saleratus plain with curious masses of porous red and black basalt protruding from a ghastly white. The watershed was apparently to the north. The benches were distinctly marked, and the bottom looked as if it were inundated every year. It was smooth, except where broken up by tracks, but all of the road was dangerous ground. In one place the horses sank to their hocks and were not extricated without difficulty. After a hot drive, the glass at 9 a.m. showed 74 degrees Fahrenheit. We began to toil up the divide, a sand formation mixed with bits of granite, red seeds, and dwarf shells, whose lips were for the most part broken off. Over the fine, loose surface was a floating haze of the smaller particles, like the film that veils the Arabian desert. Arrived at the summit, we sighted for the first time Carson Lake, or rather the sink of the Carson River. It derives its name from the well-known mountaineer whose adventurous roamings long anticipated scientific exploration. Supplied by the stream from the eastern flank of the Sierra Nevada, it is just such a lake as might be formed in any of the basins we had traversed, a shallow sheet of water which, in the cloudy sky and mitigated glare of the sun, looked pale and muddy. Apparently it was divided by a long, narrow, ruddy line, like ochre-colored sand. A near approach showed that water on the right side was separated from a saleratus bed on the left by a thick bed of tule rush. Stones imitated the sweep of the tide, and white particles the color of a wash. Our conscientious informant at Sand Springs Station had warned us upon the summit of the divide we should find a perpendicular drop, down which the wagons could be lowered only by means of lariats affixed to the axle trees and lashed round strong stubbing posts. We were not, however, surprised to find a mild descent of about 30 degrees. From the summit of the divide, 5 miles led us over a plain too barren for sage, and a stretch of stone and saleratus, to the watery margin, which was troublesome with sloughs and mud. The cattle relished the water, although tainted by the rush. We failed, however, to find any of the freshwater clams whose shells were scattered along the shore. Remounting at 5:15 p.m., we proceeded to finish the 10 miles, which still separated us from the station by a rough and stony road, perilous to wheel conveyances, and rounded the southern extremity of the lake. After passing a promontory whose bold projection had been conspicuous from afar, and threading down a deep canyon leading toward the lake, we fell into its selvage, which averaged about 1 mile in breadth. The small crescent of the moon soon ceased to befriend us, and we sat in the sadness of the shade, till presently a light glimmered under Arcturus. The road bent toward it, and all felt jolly. But, hui hui, nos miseros quam totus emotio nil est. A long, dull hour still lay before us, and we were approaching civilized lands. Sink Station looked well from without. There was a frame house inside an adobe enclosure, and a pile of wood and a stout haystack promised fuel and fodder. The inmates, however, were asleep, and it was ominously long before a door was opened. At last appeared a surly cripple, who presently disappeared to arm himself with his revolver. The judge asked civilly for a cup of water. He was told to fetch it from the lake, which was not more than a mile off, though as the road was full of quagmires it would be hard to travel at night. Wood the churl would not part with. We offered to buy it, to borrow it, to replace it in the morning. He told us to go for it ourselves, and that after about 2.5 miles we might chance to gather some. Certainly our party was a law-abiding and self-governing one. Never did I see men so tamely bullied. They threw back the fellow's sticks, and cold, hungry, and thirsty, simply began to sulk. An Indian standing by asked $20 to herd the stock for a single night. At last, George, the cordon bleu, took courage. Some went for water, others broke up a wagon plank, and supper, after a fashion, was concocted. I preferred passing the night on a side of bacon in the wagon to using the cripple's haystack, and allowed sleep to steep my senses in forgetfulness, after deeply regretting that the Mormons do not extend somewhat further westward. Fort Churchill, 18th of October. The boys in the stock were doomed to remain near the Carson Lake, where forage was abundant, while we made our way to Carson Valley, an arrangement not effected without excessive grumbling. At last the deserted ones were satisfied with the promise that they should exchange their desert quarters for civilization on Tuesday, and we were permitted to start. Crossing a long plain bordering on the Sink, we snaked up painfully a high divide, which a little engineering skill would have avoided. From the summit, bleak with west wind, we could descry at a distance of 50 miles a snowy saddleback, the Sierra Nevada. When the deep sand had fatigued our cattle, we halted for an hour to bait in a patch of land rich with bunch grass. Descending from the eminence, we saw a gladdening sight, the Carson River winding through its avenue of dark cottonwoods, and far off the quarters and barracks of Fort Churchill. The nearer view was a hard tamped plain besprinkled with black and red porous stones, and a sparse vegetation with the ruddy and yellow autumnal hues. A miserable range of low, brown, sunburnt rocks and hills, whose ravines were choked with white sand drifts, bounded the basin. The farther distance used it as a foil. The Sierra developed itself into 4 distinct, magnificent tiers of snow-capped and cloud-veiled mountain, whose dissolving views faded into thin darkness as the sun disappeared behind their gigantic heads. While we admired these beauties, night came on. The paths intersected one another, and despite the glow and gleam of a campfire in the distance, we lost our way among the tall cottonwoods. Dispersing in search of information, the marshal accidentally stumbled upon his predecessor in office, Mr. Smith, who hospitably insisted upon our becoming his guests. He led us to a farmhouse already half-roofed in against the cold, fetched the whiskey for which our souls craved, gave to each a peach that we might be good boys, and finally set before us a prime beefsteak. Before sleeping, we heard a number of shooting stories. Where the corpse is, says the Persian, there will be kites. A mining discovery never fails to attract from afar a flock of legal vultures, attorneys, lawyers, and judges. As the most valuable claims are mostly parted with by the ignorant fortunate for a song, it is usual to seek some flaw in the deed of sale, and a large proportion of the property finds its way into the pockets of the acute professional who works on half profits. Consequently, in these parts, there's generally a large amount of unscrupulous talent. One gentleman judge had knifed a waiter and shot a senator. Another, almost as heavy on the shoot, had in a single season killed one man and wounded another. My informants declared that in and about Carson, a dead man for breakfast was the rule. Besides accidents perpetually occurring to indifferent or to peacemaking parties, they reckoned per annum 50 murders. In a peculiar fit of liveliness, an intoxicated gentleman will discharge his revolver in a ballroom, and when the shooting begins in the thin-walled frame houses, those not concerned avoid bullets and splinters by jumping into their beds. During my 3 days' stay at Carson City, I heard of 3 murders. A man heavy on the shoulder who can hit out straight from the hip is a valuable acquisition. The gambler or professional player, who in the eastern states is exceptionally peaceful because he fears the publicity of a quarrel, here must distinguish himself as a fighting man. A curious story was told to illustrate how the ends of justice might, at a pinch, in the case of a popular character, be defeated. A man was convicted of killing his adversary after saying to the bystanders, "Stoop down while I shoot me the son of a dog," a female. Counsel for the people showed malice prepense. Counsel for defense pleaded that his client was rectus in curia, and manifestly couldn't mean a man but a dog. The judge ratified the verdict of acquittal. Such was the state of things, realizing the old days of the Californian gold diggings. When I visited in 1860 Carson City, its misrule, or rather want of rule, was probably long since passed away, leaving no more traces than a dream. California has been transformed by her Vigilance Committee, so ignorantly and unjustly declaimed against in Europe and in the eastern states of the Union, from a savage autonomy to one of the most orderly of the American republics, and San Francisco, her capital, from a den of thieves and prostitutes, gamblers and miners, the offscourings of nations, to a social status not inferior to any of the most favored cities.